I'd like to start this discussion today as we would if we were in Australia, which is to do an acknowledgement of country. And land acknowledgements, I think, are still not commonplace in the US, at least on the East Coast. But in Australia, they are always the way we begin gatherings and meetings, even in people's private houses. So today we are speaking and gathering on unceded lands, both in North America and Australia. For me, speaking from New York, and for many of the listeners in New Jersey, we're on Lenape lands. And in Sydney, the place where I write and work, and I think from where Charlotte is speaking, is Gadigal land. Are you on Gadigal land, Charlotte?
Yes, I'm in Gadigal land of the Eora people.
Yes. And so the purpose of the land acknowledgement is to recognise the ongoing presence of First Nations people, past, present, and emerging, their ongoing custodianship of these lands, and our debt to their long-term custodianship. And today, as we talk about novels and storytelling, to think about the way in which the knowledge and the stories that we are speaking about have deep human histories and ways of connecting land, waterways, and air, and being mindful of histories of occupation and invasion can really change the way that we work and read and learn now. And so that's why we do land acknowledgement in Australia and why we're starting today's with one. So welcome. We are really lucky to be speaking to Charlotte Wood, who, as Charlotte's heard me say this before, but it deserves to be said again, she is a national treasure in Australia. It's a massive get that we have her.
You sound very old, Sophie.
To our class, you are a young national treasure. Even before you were shortlisted for the Booker Prize for this remarkable novel, Stone Yard Devotional, you're a national treasure, but even more now. Charlotte is the author of many novels, essays, and nonfiction, and Stone Yard Devotional was greeted worldwide with rave reviews and accolades of all kinds, including in many of our most august newspapers here, the Washington Post and the New York Times, and it has just actually been named Book of the Week in the New York Times. So that's both really wonderful news and also hugely vindicating that we're sitting here and that this is our Book of the Week. So congratulations, Charlotte, and thank you so much for coming to join English 370, the contemporary novel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of open things with something quite general. If you had a Post-it note over your desk, maybe you did have a Post-it note over your desk when you were writing Stone Yard Devotional, and it had a note to yourself about the most important things that you wanted to get across in writing the novel, whether those were technical questions or thematic or both, what would the Post-it note have said?
This is a great question because indeed I did have a post. I have a lot of Post-it notes around. I have one I'm looking at behind you right now. It's a William Kentridge print that says "A safe space for stupidity." That's very handy to have in your studio. But I did have one that I sort of carried around with me in my head and on bits of paper, which was a remark made by W.B. Yeats that I came across maybe even before I started writing this book, but it's in an essay that he wrote called The Cutting of an Agate. But the remark was, he said, "Only that which does not teach, which does not cry out, which does not condescend, and which does not explain is irresistible." And it just really struck me with great force, that remark, because I think I felt that maybe in the past I have written quite didactically in some books, particularly in the book called The Natural Way of Things. And also that I was so tired of reading contemporary fiction and of the impulse in myself in contemporary writing, my own writing, to kind of teach or admonish or deliver a message or kind of finger wag about, all the things that I opinionize in fiction, which I began to found very boring and sort of depressing in some way. So as a kind of, it was a tonal challenge, a technical challenge. And the idea of not explaining everything was so kind of thrilling. And, you and I have spoken before about the sort of people-pleasing impulse in writing, and that idea that you must explain everything so nobody is ever confused or unclear about exactly what you mean in your novel, and you need to make it easy and palatable. The idea of abandoning that was just very exciting to me. So I kind of really kept that Yeats remark with me. And every time I started to kind of waver in my intention, I'd go, no explaining, no condescending, no crying out, no teaching. So
it's a fantastic remark, the Yeats one, which I've never heard. And I,
of course I came across it in one of those terrible, brainy quote thing, somehow random Instagram thing. It's not that I sit around reading a lot of W.B. Yeats's essays. But I did go and find the essay from which it comes, to make sure it was actually something that he did say. And a lot of that was completely incomprehensible to me, I was going to say. But I still, that remark, it's feel like I've got it engraved on my body now. I love it.
So brilliant. And so when we spoke a little bit about Stone Yard Devotional in the context of another conversation, which I want to mention briefly in a minute, I had the impression that your decision not to people please with this novel had not necessarily started when you started writing the novel, that it was maybe a kind of belated or, part way through the process thing. Can you think of moments in the novel or bits, I suppose, that you had to redraft in order to not let them be too people pleasing?
Look, in some ways, it was more a matter of bits that I would not redraft, that I would let stay as in this sort of slightly weird, a lot of it was about placement of things that really logically don't make sense, there's a bit about, the day in the life of the nuns, and then a memory of my narrator making a bed sometime in the past. And there's a tiny little scene where she basically said, I came home from work one day and my bed was covered in all this crap, iPads and papers, and I suddenly wanted this kind of clarity on the bed, so I lifted the sheet and put it down. Anyway, it's a tiny little thing. I remember the day I wrote that. Well, it's funny how many people have remarked on it. It makes no sense in terms of the story, or, if I was in a writing class at university, that, or everyone in the class would be saying, well, what's the relationship of that to that? And it doesn't have any bearing on, So there was so much in this book that it was so instinctively written. And the not people pleasing was to stick with the instinct, to leave it there. And what I have found, to my kind of great surprise, is that those are the things that people seem to respond most strongly to as readers. And that, I kind of feel really dumb that I haven't really done this before or committed to it before. But I realized how much courage it takes actually to do that, to stick with your instincts about things that don't make sense logically. And yet you have something in the back of your mind or in your subconscious or whatever that says, I want to put this here. And so to trust that, it takes a long, long time to trust that instinct. And it turns out that so many of those things that don't make sense are things that people, when I do readings and whatever, that people bring up in their questions, or they say, this bit I remembered so clearly, or this bit made me cry, even though it had nothing to do with the story. And so I think if I had not committed to this no explaining thing, I might have, lost my nerve a bit and thought, well, that doesn't really belong there. And, or maybe I need to explain it more about why the making of the bed relates to blah. It's so liberating. You just, you're just going to put it there. And
that's so fascinating. And I love that you picked that example, actually, because when I was reading the book, I forget exactly what the word was that you had for the tangled bed sheet, but it wasn't tangled. It was, do you remember? It's something really good. And I remember thinking it totally jumped out. And I suppose it was partly that it was a very concrete, recognizable domestic moment set in a section of the book that in some ways is gesturing toward bigger picture, you know, sort of highfalutin, you know, spiritual stuff. So that was part of it. But I think also now that you're saying that, it's the fact that you didn't offer any context or explanation for the bad bed situation that really made it work. Because if it had been in a sequence of like waking up or something, it would have been a bit of a cliche, but it wasn't a cliche at all. I'll admit it did also make me wonder whether you had in real life had a moment where your bed disorderly.
Well, look, I mean, there are some private things. That, no, I do know about, you know, that poorly made bed. But I think the thing that interestingly seems to, when people bring up that thing, and you know, people in the class who haven't read it will be thinking, why are they banging on about making a bed? But that there's part of that little vignette where she throws the sheet up and she says something about the air, the piece of the air billowing inside the sheet as it falls.
Yeah.
And I do think there's something everybody recognizes in that. There's some moment of almost stillness in that very mundane routine thing that we all do, that I suppose the paying of attention to that tiny little moment did something. But, you know, it's not, oh, how will I convey, you know, a moment of peace? You know, it just has to come sort of naturally. Maybe more experience to trust that these things will carry their own meaning if you let them.
That's great. And on the subject of attention, there's that nice bit quite late in the book, I think, or in the second half anyway, where you quote Simone Weil, and quite famous remark that she makes about paying unmixed attention to things and how, I forget exactly, I should have it.
It's sort of something, me too, but it's something like attention is a form of prayer, basically.
That's right.
That's
right.
And it's a kind of, you know, great moral act is the paying of attention.
Which was sort of her educational philosophy and life philosophy. I love Simone Weil. And so I did wonder with that quotation, because there are so many moments in this book where attention is the form of prayer, or prayer is the paying of attention. And I wondered whether how you'd come to insert that quotation into the book. Was that an explaining moment? Was it did it come organically into the narrative?
It was one of those things that I just, you know, I loved the books of Elizabeth Strout, of recently Deborah Levy's Living autobiographies.
So good.
And Sigrid Nunez's last several, well, I love all her books, but and I loved probably especially Sigrid Nunez, and you know, Simone Weil is one of her people too, I think. Where, you know, I had an early reader of the book saying, well, this woman seems very literary. You know, she's always talking about writers, and, you know, that doesn't really necessarily fit. And that was one of those things where I thought, yep, I don't care. Yeah, I'm keeping it, you know, like she's read books, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's feasible. So I suppose that's one of the things we're so used to especially in learning to write, that things always have to be sort of consistent. You know, I'm always interested in characters seem to come alive to me when they're not consistent, when they don't behave consistently, when they don't behave like a nun or like a, I don't know, social worker or a policeman. You know, if you do something that's basically out of stereotype,
right?
Then they start to come alive.
Yeah.
So I just kept anyway, and so I guess I was, you know, reading a little bit around ideas of religion, although I really kind of deliberately avoided that, because as soon as I started to try and do proper research, my brain just went dead. And you know, I've got so many books on nuns behind me that they sort of opened the first page and went, oh. Yeah. So I decided to just again go with my gut on these things. And then, though I just had heaps of those little things that really struck me as sort of instructions, I suppose, about way to live that weren't me instructing, but other people. So
Yes.
Elie Wiesel, Simone Weil, and there are others that I now can't remember, but
Yeah.
and because the narrator is sort of trying to work out how to ethically live as well.
Yeah.
So
No, it's great. And on the kind of nuts and bolts of the story, and you must have been asked this a billion times, but I'm going to ask you anyway. It's a very persuasive description of living in a convent, or I guess being on retreat. How much work experience did you do for it?
Look, years and years ago, a friend of mine was going to visit a monastery. There's all this sort of distinctions between monastery and nunnery, convents, whatever.
Yes. What is it?
The nuns call it a monastery, monastery, even though it's women, not men. But and these places do have these guest houses to stay in. People go there for a kind of religious retreat, but you can go and stay there for no reason at all. And I know one writer who often goes and stays in one of these places has the best writing place because no one talks to you, no one comes near you.
Yeah.
And you pay to stay in it. So I went with a friend who was going there for her spiritual reasons. And I did kind of lie on the floor and stare out the window. And so that kind of basic infrastructure, I guess, of the outside of the monastery came from a couple of notes then. But mainly my interpretation of life in communal living in that way comes from going on many, many artist retreats that I've been on over the years. You know, places in Australia, there's a place called Varuna, which is a writer's centre, where you have this sort of communal living and working, or other retreats that I've done by myself where I've been, you know, for weeks without speaking to anybody.
Wow.
Just to get work done.
Yeah.
And so that is very familiar to me, that sense of time really slowing down. But also those moments of kind of friction with, you know, these people you're supposed to be living in harmony with that actually drive you crazy. And so, you know, the little rubbing up against moments in the kitchen or laying the table or whatever that can help create some, you know, hopefully small moments of interpersonal drama, friction.
It was very vivid. I'm holding off on my food question because I want to say it was a special treat. But a last question, I suppose, about the setup sort of aspects of the novel. I had a class earlier today with a small group of the bigger group, and who are in my little tutorial, and we were asking each other questions about whether this book could have been the same book or could have had the same impact had it not been a religious community that she had joined. And what I was thinking, although I didn't say this to my class at the time because I wanted to save it for when I was talking to you, is that one of our previous conversations was about Elizabeth Strout's novel, My Name is Lucy Barton, which you picked as being a novel that had had a big impact on you. And in that novel, the protagonist, who is not a million miles away from your protagonist, is in hospital or is remembering a stay that she had in hospital when she was a younger woman. And it's that same quality of retreat, meditation, and actually characters behaving in stereotypical ways, like the doctor isn't like a doctor and the mother's not like a mother and so on. How important is the religion in the book, in your book?
Good question. I mean, it's important in that my woman is such an outsider to that life, and she never quite gets there in terms of religious belief. She has no religious belief, but she respects what these people are doing and she tries to understand it. So I suppose for me that was important in that if she had gone somewhere where, you know, if it was, I don't know, a yoga retreat or you know, I don't know, just a women's commune or something, it wouldn't have had the same hustle for her that she has internally of like, A, I don't belong here. What am I doing here? B, I don't want to leave, even though I don't belong here. C, I don't believe what they believe. And yet maybe what they believe is more, is a better way to live than I have always lived. So I wanted that internal wrestling to go on for her all the time and to not resolve. Yeah, it doesn't really resolve.
Yeah.
So that was important, and I don't think it could have been done. And also, it allowed me to kind of look back on my own kind of Catholic upbringing,
Was there
to see, well, what did it do to me? When I was younger, I was just like, that rubbish, and and I am leaving it behind, and I did, and yet, which is these words come up in the book, and yet. It formed me as a writer, I think, in many ways, of, having to go to church and be bored senseless once a week.
Yeah.
My entire childhood, boredom is very good for children, but also the kind of metaphorical sense of things, crazy stuff in the Bible, but the rhythm of language, the kind of richness of the sensory world, all of that was really important, I think, for my creative life.
As a writer, you must have thought a lot about boredom, have you?
Well, I've certainly been being bored a lot.
Being bored, managing boredom, sort of allowing yourself to be bored.
Yeah, and in fact, it's sort of, I remember reading, I don't know if it was Margaret Atwood or someone, or Margaret Drabble. You have to get properly bored before you can write properly. And I'm heading back into my new novel now, and it's just that feeling of resentment and boredom, and it's like there's something really important about being bored, and it's actually very, very hard to be properly bored now with the online world, just available distraction, available at your fingertips all the time, and it's something I'm really needing to just work hard at getting out of that.
Charlotte, I'm going to make a transition now to speaking about the novel as Australian literature. So I asked the students this morning whether they'd read an Australian novel before, and I think no one had. And so I gave them a little bit of a primer on what Australian fiction does. And I talked about the sort of tension between the European tradition and the First Nations tradition and all of those kinds of things. But in some ways, your novel, it's not a global novel because the setting's very specific, but it's not screaming Australian. And I wondered how purposeful that was and how you think of yourself as fitting into the Australian literary tradition.
It's something that I don't want to think about, I mean, I'm interested in talking about it, but as I'm writing, I don't think, okay, where do I fit in Australian literature? Because as soon as I become too conscious of it, then you end up, going into kind of really very well-worn tracks. Yeah. And yet all those things, as you said, are absolutely a part of our literature and a part of my growing up, So a lot of this book is very, very autobiographical. I grew up in the area the narrator grows up at the same time. The relationship with the mother in the book is very much my relationship with my mother. A skewed portrait of my mother because, for a start, my mother had 5 children and there's only one in the book. And obviously every child in the family has a different mother, even if it's the same mother. But, the landscape is hugely important in the book. And I couldn't have written the book with that much sort of attachment to landscape that I didn't know really well, because I would have been, the natural way of things has an invented landscape that's cobbled from my experience of different places in Australia. But it's funny, in the UK, people keep talking about this book as, it's set in the outback, and any Australian just goes, oh, God, no,
it's not. That's so funny. If the students were visible, I'd ask if people thought it was set in the outback. Since they can't weigh in, please explain to our listeners why it's not the outback.
I don't even know that the outback is something Australians really say. It's a kind of generic term, meaning the central desert, Central Australia, red dirt, desert, Uluru, farms in the middle of the country kind of thing. And this place is set very near the coast, but inland, in southern New South Wales, on a place called the Monero Plain. I guess that, we have such a limited reputation in terms of landscape. We have the coast, the desert. But actually there's this huge variation in the landscape. But there's certainly that sense of, do we as white people belong in this landscape? And the unease of that is very present. It's a very live topic in our country, as you know. The long tail of colonization is very destructive. Our relationship, white Australia's relationship with First Nations people is appalling.
Yeah.
It's just terrible disadvantage, and colonization is not over, and in fact, possibly worse than ever for Indigenous people. That's a fact that I don't want to write that into my novels, because I have sort of tried and I can't do it, because it becomes immediately teaching, admonishing, condescending. So I have a very glancing reference to what I was told in my childhood about Aboriginal people on the land. And I'll just hold the cover of the book up because that is the play. There's a discussion about an Aboriginal burial ground. But the ways that when I was a child, we were taught that, there was never any Aboriginal people here. So, we didn't do anything bad by being here, kind of thing, which, then there are some local Aboriginal people saying, well, we were always here and we're still here.
Yeah.
But there was a kind of migratory, people moved through the area in the nomadic kind of situation. But anyway, so that was a very tiny glancing reference that I really put in quite near the end of the process, because I thought, I'm writing, a lot of this book is about burial, unearthing, reburial. And then I came across this very small vignette about some discovery of some very ancient Aboriginal artifact in a grave by a creek. And I just thought, well, I can't talk about burial and reburial without acknowledging this huge problem. Reality.
Was actually, as an Australian, and I don't know, you will probably know how this has landed with non-Australian audiences. It was actually one of the most resonant and sort of important moments in the book, actually, because you've been telling the story of burying someone's bones, the nun who's died, and then we are reminded that there is this, a millennia-long story of burial on those very lands by First Nations people, and that they are still there and that they're ongoing. And, it was a really good not explaining it bit. You put it in and you didn't explain it. But it did create this, for me, wonderful sense of both discord between the European use and inhabiting of the land and the Aboriginal sense of belonging to the land. And it was both discord and belonging. I thought it was a really beautifully turned moment. And, in all of your writing, I suppose, but particularly in this book, do you think that sort of shadow of First Nations ownership and displacement from Australian landscape, for you, is that the biggest presence when you're thinking about being a white writer in Australia?
Yeah, very, very aware, and very aware increasingly of an argument that some First Nations writers are having here, which is basically, as a colonial settler writer, you should shut up about the landscape.
Right.
Which is very confronting and, interesting, and wrestle. That's the idea that I could write about a white woman having a deep kind of almost bodily attachment to land, which is what my narrator does have, and what, frankly, I feel about that landscape where I grew up. It's controversial in some ways. I have had one or two Aboriginal writers I know absolutely love the book. And in fact, one of them asked me, did the mother in the book have Aboriginal heritage? Because she said that spoke to this Aboriginal writer very strongly of her mother's feeling. And, I had to say, no, that's my mother. And
Yeah.
who was British, like an immigrant English woman. I mean, I was sort of very moved by that, actually. But, it's certainly absolutely contested
Yeah.
material, and
Yeah.
rightly so.
So I think the best place for us to sort of hold that section of this conversation is just to recognize that it is contested, and there isn't sort of an answer, I think, in your book or in Australia.
I just said one thing about that very brief section about the grave and the real estate development. I was very careful to take that exactly from life. So
Yeah.
I would not have invented anything to do with Aboriginal cultural heritage. I would never, ever invent that as a white writer. And I think, that's a line that I would never cross.
That's a really important thing to say, actually. And I think it would go without saying in Australia to some extent, because I think that is an understanding that has been well communicated now by First Nations leaders. And I think it's a line that white writers wouldn't cross, but it's probably still quite important.
Yeah, occasionally they still do. So you can see why Aboriginal writers is just saying, you've appropriated everything of our lives, just stop.
Will you say something about the Helen Parry character? She's a fantastic character, I thought. She's very strong. We feel intense sympathy for her. The descriptions of the childhood and her adolescence are just absolutely wrenching. And she's also kind of an off-putting character. She's a great character. How was it putting that character together? When did it come to you?
Well, it came in sort of patches, as things often do when I'm writing. I write a bit about a schoolgirl here. I write a bit about a nun here. I write a bit about the neighbour, Richard Gittins, over there. It took me a long time to realise, they all belong there. So first of all, there's a story early on about a schoolgirl, and I won't sort of go into the detail because I'd like you to read it. But basically a bullied schoolgirl. And I was writing about Helen Parry because there are these nuns around the world, these rogue, wild, radical activist nuns who I just have nothing but sheer admiration for. And it took me a long time to kind of discover that, that schoolgirl and Helen Parry are the same person. And Richard Gittins, the neighbour, he's this nice man who comes and helps the nuns from time to time. I just remember one day I was at the coast I was writing, and I was driving down the hill after a swim, and I thought, they all belong there. I needed a reason, like what was the actual connection between the neighbour, Helen Parry, my narrator, and I thought, they all went to school together. So that suddenly gave me something, I don't even know how to describe it, but kind of anchor or something for a bit more depth to their connection with each other. And then the Helen Parry thing sort of took off because they actually have this sort of troubled history together. But initially that was just one of those, there's quite a lot of quite random little stories about, often quite sad things that the narrator remembers from her childhood, or moments where people are being outcast or marginalized in some way. But then I loved the fact that I could make those things that made Helen Parry an outcast as a child. The fact that she wouldn't submit, that she wouldn't kind of obey the rules of the playground and go, well, you're the pariah, you should shut up and sit over there because you're poor and your mother beats you. She just, as a child, ignored that and went up and spoke to people as though they were her friends, which was just against the rules, in the playground. But those are the things that make her such a powerful adult. Refusal to submit, taking up space, speaking up and talking back, and also make her a very powerful, political advocate, and also really quite unpleasant person. Like she's doing all these great things in the world, and you do not want to hang around with her because she's difficult. And I think that's probably true of loads of amazing people who change the world, and not going to suddenly turn into sweet-natured little mild-mannered people when you're having dinner with them.
That's certainly true. And I thought one of the things that just made that character so effective is you must have felt, or maybe the temptation to join the dots too much. She's a worthy but sort of difficult adult. She had a difficult childhood, and to somehow try and make the worthiness and the unlikability somehow make them all neatly packaged. But actually it all just coexists. And where sometimes when you're reading the novel, a couple of times actually I had to check it was the same person, that the person who was unpleasant in a particular moment with the protagonist, or just unyielding, I guess, was Ellen Parry, who was this activist hero nun. And I loved the fact that it was the same person and that you didn't explain.
I do think literature surely allows this complexity. That's the point of literature for me, that we can have all of these completely different people in the same person, because we're all much more complicated than activist, or bullied child. And that's why I also wanted to have, this idea of forgive, where my narrator kind of owns up to Helen Parry that I'm so sorry about the way we treated you at school. And she wants sort of absolution in some way, and Helen Parry will not give it to her. But she doesn't say, I won't forgive you. She just goes,
yeah, that must
say, see ya. And so that sort of leaving her there with this unresolved feeling was, I don't know, I had really enjoyed playing with that, to go, things are not necessarily resolved in our lives all the time.
It was so spiky. I'm going to ask you a last question, then we'll see if people have questions for the chat, and you can put them in the chat now if you'd like to. So I've been saving this one because it's my favorite, and that's the food. So Charlotte and I already know that we both like food a lot, and I love the way that you paid attention to the food in the book. I love the way that food is so indifferent at the beginning, and you just pick up on small things about institutional food, like the sort of tabbouleh, for some reason, was a month bit on, and just an attentiveness to the food. And then the slight that the one thing that made me too happy in this book was that she takes over the cooking in the modern. And, I was just really happy about it. So you talk about your relationship to food.
Yeah, well, that was allowing me to, play cooking and food in fiction, which I play cooking. I love to cook and eat, but I also think food is really fascinating as a kind of signifier of human relation, or as a point of power and control in human relationships. They eat all this crap, mac and cheese in a box and stuff, and they're trying to save money. And my narrator says, well, you can actually save money by eating real food, buying in bulk and blah, blah, blah. And then the boss nun says, oh, good, you can do that, which causes friction because some of the other nuns like the crappy mac and cheese out of a box food. And I did have a great pleasure in putting in something that the husband of one of my friends, and he's a very conservative eater, and she is a very good cook. And she said, oh, whenever I make anything with vegetables in it, her partner walks past and goes, that looks healthy. So I had great pleasure in putting that, where one of the nuns goes, oh, that looks healthy. Doesn't that look healthy? Isn't that great? But I hate that stuff. Or, they like potato, but they won't eat, brown rice. So I think food can say a lot about class. It can say a lot about curiosity or lack of, or a certain level of cultural sophistication or not. There's money involved. I think food is really, really useful in fiction. And a lot of the time when we read about food in fiction, it's kind of done to impress in some way. It's quite, someone's making a beautiful salad with pomegranates and whereas crappy food is more interesting to write about. Right. Or often food is sort of exoticized. Cooking is exoticized. And I just like writing about food that actually people do eat. I have a niece staying with me at the moment who does not eat lots of things. So not just like, oh, I don't like fish. And, she's just a very young, conservative kind of eater. So I'm having to negotiate my way with.
Do you feel like you have to hold yourself back from talking about food too much when you write? You notice food too much, basically.
Yeah. I have to hold back from writing about the kind of food that I would actually
Want to eat. Yeah.
because I cook nice food and but it's all very middle class,
Yeah.
very, nice white lady who's traveled a bit kind of food, Ottolenghi. So
Okay.
Ottolenghi rules. So I'm never putting an Ottolenghi dish in a book.
Charlotte, congrats on the book, which is just such a beautiful book. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sophie. Hope we can talk again sometime soon.
Me too. And see you back in Sydney.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.